Welcome back. Now, 3 people are expected to appear in court soon following an alleged mob justice incident in Zandspruit, north of Johannesburg. The incident left 5 people dead after angry residents took 9 young men to a local sports ground, beat them up and set them alight. And they've been accused of terrorising the community. Now, whilst policing experts and some political parties have condemned the incident, it brings back to the fore the issue of mob justice or vigilantism. And what is it that leads to communities taking the law into their own hands? So to help us unpack this phenomenon and what we're currently seeing, we're joined by Nomfundo Mogapi, as she's a clinical psychologist and executive director at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. Nomfundo, good morning. Thanks so much for speaking to us.
Good morning, Shakina. Thank you for having me.
An absolute pleasure. Now, Nomfundo, unfortunately, the subject at hand is not really, a pleasurable one, because we are talking about the communities at this point seemingly hurtful. They've had enough, and they are once again taking the law into their own hands. And while the Zandspruit incident is enjoying prominence, there are other incidents that perhaps are not as widely or well reported as the Zandspruit one. But we come from a history in this country. We've had the days of Pagat, we've had the days of Mapoho. All of that has happened, and the communities seemingly are under siege at this point. But let's start by just looking at the definitions of what is going on here. Vigilantism, what is it, and is it criminal?
Yeah, so I think there's really a number of ways in which we needed to look at this, Shakina. Of course, we can look at vigilantism and mob justice, and definitely, of course, it is criminal because you're taking the law in your hands, and at times, people who are frustrated and they use vigilantism because they are seeing it as the last option, end up themselves becoming murderers, and robbing their children of the fathers and mothers because now they have become that. So it is definitely when people decide that they are now going to take the law in their hands because they may not be trusting the mainstream law. But for me, Shakina, I think for us as a society, I would really like us to take a step back and look at a much more comprehensive analysis, because for me, these vigilante attacks, so you call it mob justice, are really as symptoms of much bigger issues that are taking place in our society. They are an indication or an eruption of things that we've left for so long unattended and undealt with. And we can talk about those a little bit more, ranging from there's a lot of things that we've left unaddressed, and COVID just exacerbated these things. So we are now left with societies that are feeling discouraged, hopeless. And when then someone comes in and takes whatever they think is precious to them, that person or that criminal becomes the representation of all that is wrong and a recipient of the rage of the society. And at the times, as a society or as communities that are frustrated, we don't even take time to really think about the impact of what we are doing on ourselves, on our children, and on our society at large.
And that's another key element here, because if we look at what ultimately happens when community members latch onto the criminal element, the sort of rage and violence that we see accompanying that really begs many questions of us as a society, because how do you bring yourself to burn someone alive? So can we talk about that, and what is the psychology behind that sort of action?
Yeah, Shakina, and I just want to highlight that, the mob justice is just one example. We see it with the xenophobic attacks. We see it, it says we've been working on the issues of violence and working in communities for the past 30 years now. And we've been saying in the past few years that we are really concerned about just the increase in the gruesome nature of the violence. With COVID-19, it has actually become even worse. Some of the communities are saying, we are reminded of the times even during apartheid, the kind of violence we are seeing now in our communities. So there's really something just happening at a deep psychological level. So for me, Shekina, if we were to analyze this, I think we are really dealing with things that we have left unaddressed for a very long time, because we had thought that as a society, they are not important. And now we are realizing how critical they are. So it is an interaction between the work I've been talking about for the longest time, which is the unresolved trauma in our society at a collective level, institutional level, at a personal level. We have left addressing the psyche of the society, or we unaddressed for too long, Shakina. And it is catching up with us because we haven't fully appreciated that when our souls are broken, our spirits are broken, and our psyche is not okay, it affects how we react to frustrations in society. We have left too long the issue of poverty, unemployment, and inequality in our country, Shakina. And I have said in many of the platforms where I have talked that when you have these unattended psychological issues, I mean, the levels of depression and anxiety in our society have increased exponentially. When you have this not addressed, and you have people who have had a history of being excluded so economically by a system that was designed to degrade them, when in the present day they continue to not have jobs, they continue to not have employment, it feels like it's a re-experiencing of the trauma. And of course, it does fuel the rage. And now most of the younger people who are supposed to be employed are people that didn't have the lived experience of apartheid, but they are still stuck in the trauma of their parents. And then there's another thing, Shekina, that I've been increasingly working on. And I mean, I've talked about, that we have a crisis of leadership in a society. And for me, I think we haven't invested sufficiently in the things that make institutions work. Like whether it's a police or it's a Department of Health, but what makes an organization work? It is a leader with high levels of emotional intelligence. It's leadership that know how to cultivate cultures that fuel performance, cultures that create safety in the organization. But what we are finding, Shakina, which really concerns me in our society, is just the increase of toxicity within our institutions. With COVID, I've had an opportunity to work with a number of institutions, and people are just saying our leaders are tired, are exhausted, but they've become increasingly violent themselves. And the police department, which is expected, of course, to deal with the issue later on, there is a huge leadership crisis there. So take all of this, Shakina, and then you have this community that is feeling completely let down, frustrated, traumatized. And then there's this one young man who comes in and steals a TV. And then that young man becomes a representation of all that is wrong. And if I don't have the power to deal with all these larger things, but there's this young man that I can at least hit, I feel like I have some kind of control in my life, then of course that person is going to be a recipient of this rage. So it's really important to analyze all these things that we think are not linked with the mob justice, but actually they are the key issue that is fueling the crisis that we are having now in our society.
And as you say, we have this crisis now whereby you have the criminal element in the first instance that perpetrates very heinous and violent crimes against society, and society in turn perpetrating equally heinous and violent crime against the first perpetrator, because ultimately those who administer mob justice become the perpetrators. And in all of this, and I guess this is where you have the term mob justice and vigilante justice, because people feel that they have a right to step in and administer justice if the criminal justice system itself is incapable of doing so. So can we just look at that element where people feel they have the right and they are in the right to perpetrate these crimes against perpetrators in the first instance?
Yeah. So there is a sense, and we've been saying this, that our societies are feeling that violence is the only language that we can listen to. But now it has become a currency for accessing justice. So there's this sense that, these democratic processes are actually not working. And if things are not working, if I experience so much injustice in my life, then I have a right to take the law in my hands. And when people feel that there's lawlessness in a society anyway, then what they are doing, so actually doing something that's unlawful to try and correct something that is wrong, feels okay. So there is that thing of using violence and feeling that it's actually justified to pursue violence. And then there's also that element of where even the society itself is not awake to how much rage they are carrying, that even when they do that, because of course you could go and apprehend the criminal and take them to the police. And I know the police have been asking for that. But in that moment, you don't just apprehend, right? You don't only just even punish them. Like the level of brutality is really high. And I think the challenge also, Shakina, is that most of the time we don't think that this thing that we're doing, yes, it might give us a temporary experience of justice, right? It might send a message to other criminals that you do not come here. But what it does is that for the young people that are watching, it sends a message that violence is okay as a way of dealing with issues. It's okay to use this kind of violence. And can we also just talk about the family members who lose these loved ones and what this actually does to them, who are actually killed as a result of mob justice? So we don't understand that we're trying to solve crime by using crime, but by doing that, we are actually perpetuating a culture of violence and crime and lawlessness in our society, and grooming young people who will later on become criminals because they have seen the violence being perpetuated right in front of them. So it's really not helping us in the long run, even though it might seem like temporarily it's possibly a solution.
But of course, all of this comes about because people are frustrated. People are tired. We are in a country where it seems as though you are under siege because you sit at a restaurant, someone comes, grabs a cell phone. You could be anywhere, someone walks in with a gun, robs people at gunpoint, even in the doctor's rooms. So where do you turn to? Where is the law enforcement in this regard? Because it seems as though, as a South African, you're just a walking target. You're not safe in your home. You're not safe at your workplace. You're not even safe in your place of worship. So how can we carry on like this as a society?
Yeah, Shakina, it's really painful to see, even especially for those of us who do this. And there's no holy cows anymore in our country. There's certain territories, as you explained, like churches, places that we thought at least these are safe. But the criminals have become more violent and they've become much bolder. And I think, as you are saying, Shakina, we need to go back, of course, to discussing the law enforcement. So for the longest time, the focus in our country has been on give us more police, give us more police. But we are realizing that it's not just about the increase of the police, it's the functioning of the police institution. It's having the kind of leadership that is able to create an institution that is functional, that ensures that the police are performing, that ensures, because remember that these policemen are themselves exposed to this increased violence. And there is such high levels of burnout and frustration amongst the police themselves. So how do you ensure that they are performing, that they also are taken care of, they are motivated in terms of how they do their work? But also, Shakina, I think there's work that we can begin to do at a community level. And there are some communities that are beginning to say, guys, how do we organize ourselves better? And I know it's easier said than done. It's almost like now we must be looking at solving the solution, these problems. But what we're saying is that we find that when communities are themselves much more organized, when community leadership is able to find ways, for example, you have people that will patrol on the streets, we'll have early warning signs for any violence that might be there, because these criminals are known by the community, right? It's people in the community who know them. So I think we need institutional work, but also we need work at a community level. How do we bring our communities together? And I mean, as long as our community people are hungry, Shakina, as long as people have no food to eat, going and joining a group that ensures safety feels like such a waste of time. So we need to address the socio-economic issues in our society so the communities can focus on building safety within their work. I'm talking about work, within their places.
And just finally, Nomfundo, we hear of all these terrible crimes being perpetrated, and my concern is just that we seem to have become desensitized as a society. You hear about 11 people gunned down over a weekend in Khayelitsha, and we just carry on as if nothing happened. And this is not an isolated incident. We hear about such incidents all the time. And we just seem to have normalized the loss of life. The perpetration of these heinous crimes have just become another norm, another headline that we just gloss over and be outraged for a second and move on. Surely that's not normal.
Not at all, not at all. When I've been talking about this COVID period in our society, I've been calling it, it's a period of too muchness. Or you could call it, there was a video that was going around calling it too muchery. And we really have this too muchery experience because sitting and actually not calling these people numbers, getting into the story, getting into the pain of the people, it requires that you become vulnerable. It requires that you sit with the pain. And majority of South Africans are just overwhelmed by their own pain, by the too muchery of their own pain, the loss that we are experiencing. So what we do in instances like that, we do what we call negative resilience, right? Where we just completely block off, where we do not engage, where we have apathy, or on the other side, we become extremely violent in terms of how we deal with these things. So it is, Shakina, an indication of just how much this collective trauma I've been talking about is deepening. But for me, Shakina, what even concerns me more is that if the whole society is feeling that, then the people who are in leadership, and I'm talking about political leadership, I'm talking about business leadership, family leadership, church leadership, the people who have the responsibility to create the kind of change that we want, if they are also feeling like that and they don't even deal with that, then how are they going to begin to deal with these problems? And that's why this takes me back to my previous, when I was open, that our biggest crisis is that crisis of leadership, and really saying, how do you lead in wounded context? How do you ensure that you build your own resilience, you still motivate people, you still create change, rather than being the one that fuels this problem in because of the kinds of institution that you are actually creating? Yes, we see societies going through this, but when the leaders are also the same way as what the society is, then we should really be worried.
Nomfundo, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Really appreciate your insights. And that is, of course, Nomfundo Mogapi, who is the Executive Director at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. And it's such an important discussion to have, because this is where we are as a society, dealing with all this violence, in a way being desensitized to it, but in other ways we simply become perpetrators of that same violence that we are victims of. And that's what we're asking this morning in our question of the day. What are your views on vigilantism? At Morning Live SABC is where you can tell us your views. Time now for the news at 7 with Leanne.